Can we eat a cheeseburger? We're going to talk about that and other things here on Wake Up to the Bible. I'm Daniel Kaplan here with my father, Dr. Kaplan. We're reading through the books of the law, Exodus 23:6 through 23:6 through 23:19 is what we're reading today. We're obviously reading all through Genesis and Deuteronomy. I'll be reading from the Robert Alter translation, and then we will discuss what we have read. You shall not skew the case of your indigent in his dispute.
Indigent.
Indigent in his dispute. What's an indigent?
Poor person.
Thank you. See, I should know these things. I'm a writer, but from the lying words stay far away, and the guiltless and innocent do not kill, for I will not acquit the guilty. No bribe shall you take, for a bribe blinds the sighted and perverts the words of the innocent. No sojourner shall you oppress, for you know the sojourner's heart, since you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. And 6 years shall sow your land and gather its produce, but in the 7th you shall let it go and let it lie fallow, and your people's indigent may eat of it, and what is left the beast of the field will eat. Thus shall you do for your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days shall you do your deeds, and on the 7th day you shall cease, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and your bondman and the sojourner catch their breath. And in all that I have said to you, you shall watch yourselves, and the names of other gods you shall not invoke, nor shall it be heard on your lips. 3 times in the year shall you hold me a festival. The festival of flatbread you shall keep 7 days. You shall eat flatbread as I have charged you. At the fixed time in the month of the new grain, for in it you came out of Egypt, and they shall not appear in my presence empty-handed. And the festival of the harvest, first fruits of your labor that you sow in the field, and the festival of the ingathering as the year goes out, when you gather in the labor from your field. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear in the presence of the Master the Lord. You shall not offer up the blood of my sacrifice with leavened stuff, nor shall the fat of my festival offering be left till the morning. The best of the first fruit of your soil you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. It's kind of a random aside. So let's start there. All of a sudden, we're like talking about festivals, and all of a sudden there's just this boop, it's in there. And this is the verse, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, that often gets extrapolated and becomes, you should never have meat and milk at the same meal. And there's different ways of interpreting that. Some people would say, well, you can't have meat and milk from the same animal. So you could have meat from this animal and because it's the mother's milk, right? So you could have a cheeseburger with goat cheese because it's not a goat burger. Just whether or not you can mix there's just a lot of different ways of looking at it. One of the popular reasons why people will defend the meat and milk thing is to deal with like life and death, although I'm not exactly sure why milk represents life and meat represents death, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, I could see that logic. Meat, you have to kill something to eat it. Meat is a dead animal. Milk
Is from a living animal. Yeah, okay, fair enough.
I don't agree with that, but
but let's stay there for a second though. When it says you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, you would say that we still should not boil a kid in its mother's milk, correct?
Yeah, so that's fine. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. So what would be wrong with that? Well, there's a subtlety there.
Okay.
It's a kind of a cruel thing to do in a way,
mm-hmm.
to take a kid that should be nursing on the milk and boiling it in its mother's milk. It seems to be an idea of just creating a certain sensitivity in the culture as to not to be cruel and spiteful.
Yeah,
I think that's really the point.
Some people extrapolate this too as you shouldn't kill young animals at the nursing stage for consumption. Like it's not explicit, but it's implicit to say you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk while the kid is nursing. Don't eat it. What do you think of that as a concept? Just as a general rule. Obviously, if you were starving, I'm just saying, do you think that's a smart idea that maybe we should avoid things like veal or something like that? Because that's not really the intention. The intention is for an animal to reach adulthood and then we eat it.
I don't think veal is necessarily. I don't know how. I don't know.
I don't think it's nursing level, so you're right.
Yeah, I mean, it already says that you shouldn't take an animal within 7 days. You should wait to the 8th day.
And Sean has a good point. He says keep it alive for 7 days.
Yeah,
so to some extent, you're not just going on. But an animal's not weaned after 7 days. So you don't think that somebody should extrapolate that you shouldn't eat an animal that's still weaning from that as just implicitly kind of there? It's too much.
I think
It's
it's an overreach.
okay, it's an overreach. All right.
I think so because the the,
It does
the,
not
the
explicitly say
Bible
it.
said 7 days,
Okay.
and then the eighth day you can take it. So
Okay.
um,
Fair enough.
I would say don't boil a kid in its mother's milk is very clear. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. But then the question is why not? And I think it has to do with just creating a certain approach to life, to
Right.
nature, where you're not cruel.
Yeah.
I think that's the point of it.
Right.
It's there 3 times, but one time you could say, well, it's just repeating because Deuteronomy is a second giving of the law. So many laws are repeated in Deuteronomy now that it's been 40 years and they're ready to enter the land. So you can understand why it's
Right.
repeated. However, in this particular case, it's there another time before Deuteronomy. You find it in Exodus 34.
Yeah.
But the context there has to do, I think, with well, we'll see. Let's go to Exodus 34, since I brought it up, and just see the context there. Of course, we're going to get there later anyway. But
Yeah.
um, in Exodus 34, um, it's talking about sacrifices and bringing first fruits of your land and not boiling a kid in its
That's the
mother's
same
milk.
context here too. First fruits of the land.
Yeah. So
So yeah, I could see where maybe it kind of connects to the 7 days. Perhaps it's kind of you could implicitly say that it's
maybe
kind of tied into don't take something before the 7 days. Perhaps.
that may be, but it also may have to do with the celebrating of the festivals.
Hmm.
That in your keeping of the festivals, don't do this kind of cruel act.
Yeah.
And now there are some people who argue that this was a practice in pagan religion.
There's also people that argue there's no evidence of that
Yeah,
practice, and so therefore it can't be what it means, which is why it's very dangerous when you start to look at culture and then you try to extrapolate too much.
yeah,
It can really mess you up.
yeah. I didn't go through Dennis Prager's refutation. When I was a boy, when I was a teenager, I got a paperback that's probably still circulating around called The Biblical Archaeologist Reader.
Yeah.
And they found Ugaritic. There was an ancient society of Ugarit. I think it's in what is today Syria,
Uh-huh.
and they spoke a language similar to Biblical Hebrew. And they found there in the Ugaritic writing supposedly this custom. But
Interesting.
maybe Dennis Prager says that in recent years they've retranslated it or something. I don't know what his
Or
argument
maybe he
is.
was not aware of it. But that's the
Oh no,
thing, right?
I couldn't see that he would be
Really?
unaware because that came out in the '60s.
I mean, you can't be aware of everything. But this is the thing, when you study, ancient Near East culture, well, you're going to have differences of opinion, you'll have different things. So it can
Right.
be very the idea it's become more and more trendy to try to imagine what that culture was based on our evidence and then extrapolate that back into the Bible, and I think that can be a very risky
No, I don't want to
lens.
imagine. I'm just saying that what I read was that they
No,
actually found evidence in the text that
right,
this was being done.
right.
But maybe that was a mistranslation.
I don't mean that they
Yeah.
don't base it on any evidence. I'm just
Right.
saying that we can't. Whatever evidence we have is going to be somewhat sporadic, so it's hard
But
to
I
know.
don't think people should go overboard when it says don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. It's not even talking about eating. Don't
Mm,
boil a kid in its mother's milk.
right.
To go from that to really all kinds of other things, I would want to be careful with taking a verse and just going just going wild with the verse.
Right.
Um,
Fair enough.
but
All right. So we
but
have.
no, wait a minute. I'm not saying you should eat it. Based upon this, I would say yes, you shouldn't eat it. If you can't cook it that way, then you wouldn't eat it.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But I'm just saying that,
And if somebody said that was the process, you might be like, okay, I'll
and
pass.
you
Yeah.
might even say that maybe this would apply to a calf in its mother's milk as well,
Hmm.
or not just a kid.
Right.
But it is interesting how it words it all
Right.
3 times as a kid,
Yeah.
and that tape, by the way, ties it back into Passover. That was
Right.
one reason why it's in that context. Because in Passover you could slaughter a kid
And you
for,
weren't allowed to boil it,
and I mean a baby
but you
goat,
also weren't allowed to boil it. You had to burn it over a fire.
right?
So
But
this is boiling as well. So it's interesting. There is a connection there.
right, there's a connection in theme as to maybe why
Yeah,
it's brought up here,
right.
because you could kill a young goat or a young sheep.
Well, if
for the
it was a
Passover.
practice, it might have been a practice connected to some festival, and there was a concern that there would be, the adoption of this in their festivals, perhaps.
Right. So if you have other ideas on that, I would appreciate it. Now, I grew up in a culture where we really well, if you go on El Al airline to Israel, they have two separate kitchens on the airline,
Yeah,
for meat and dairy.
right.
And by the way, if you're shopping for food and you want it to be biblically kosher, the rabbinic supervision is even stricter than what the Bible requires. And so, it would be fine to buy kosher products in that sense. But what I wanted to mention is you will sometimes see KD, on a product, meaning it's kosher and it's dairy,
Hmm.
because they don't want you to mix it with meat.
Right.
And there's even a product which is called non-dairy creamer, but sodium caseinate is used in the processing of it, and from a rabbinical point of view, it's still dairy. So non-dairy creamer, at least for Orthodox Jews, may not be appropriate to have with meat.
Yeah.
Okay. Now another thing, I'm bringing this out for cultural value. You will see sometimes KP on the label, or you'll see the word parva, Pareve. That means it's neutral. It's not meat or dairy, which
Yeah.
means you could be eaten with either.
Right.
So just when you're going shopping in the supermarket, especially in America, you'll see a lot of products labeled either kosher dairy,
Yeah.
kosher meat, or kosher parva, and now you know why. But don't listen to
Sean
these.
was asking, could you boil a lamb in cow's milk? I would say yes, based on.
Well, I don't think so.
Wait, you don't think you could boil a lamb in cow's milk? I mean, I'm not saying that's a good idea from a cooking perspective, but that's not a biblical problem.
Well, no, it's technically not, but I could
I
understand a
mean,
person.
people boil meat in milk all the time because of soups and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
Yeah, all right. But
chicken soup with milk in it is very common.
yeah,
Yeah,
that
cream of chicken soup.
well, no, the chicken is a separate issue from a lamb or a goat
Well,
or a
okay,
cow.
fair enough.
Chicken is looked on differently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious where the biblical explanation is that, but we'll probably get to it later.
Well,
All right.
but there was something that came up just a moment ago.
Kosher parva, kosher dairy.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what it was because all of a sudden, when you mentioned that question, it knocked that out of my mind.
I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, this is important. There's a certain anti-Semitism where they will claim that the kosher supervision, isn't reliable. But
Yes.
of course, obviously, in any field, there's going, will have an
I think
occasion.
the reason why is because of some of the allowances. Like kosher will allow for dye from unclean animals. Kosher will allow for a certain amount of things. Like, for example, Coca-Cola has chemicals from unclean
Yeah,
animals
but
that they allow
that is
because
not.
it's one, whatever,
I
a
don't believe it's
160th
well,
or whatever it is.
it's not biblically prohibited. Like somebody says, what if a pig dies on your land?
Hmm.
So you don't eat the meat of an animal. When you buy milk in America, the vitamin D came from a shark, but you only got the vitamin, not the meat of the shark. So
I know some people have an issue with that. I wouldn't say it's fair. I'm going to go back to the false rumor thing. I don't think it's fair to say that people that criticize rabbis for allowing vitamin D from a shark are necessarily anti Semitic. They could just be incorrectly zealous.
all right, fair enough. All
And
right,
so I want to defend those people.
all right. Yeah, I think they're being overzealous rather than
Yeah, I
anti-Semitic.
certainly don't want to mind read and assume it has to be that reason.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
See, this is what we do around here.
Peace. Yeah, okay, okay. I stand corrected on
Yeah,
that.
yeah, no, but I mean, and I understand your point. It could be, but I think it's important to know. We don't, unless you have evidence. There are that. Granted, there are some times where it is obvious that that's what's going on because of the way they're putting it. So
Yeah,
it
well,
just
yeah. That's
depends.
I have encountered that.
Yes, yes. I'm not saying that never exists. I'm just saying we can't definitively say that's the
I
only
have
reason.
encountered that. Well, I'll give you one example.
Uh oh.
There was a Jewish cab driver that was joking around
Uh huh.
about Yom Kippur with a member of the church,
Right.
and so he said, "Well, I take a shower, and if I happen to get a few mouthfuls of water, so be it." So they evidently it became a big deal, and so somebody came to me and said, when you were in the Jewish community on the Day of Atonement, did you drink while you were in the shower? The fact is, we weren't allowed to take a shower.
No.
We could only wash our hand up to not even the entire finger on the Day of Atonement. We couldn't even wash our hands fully.
Right.
So it really bothered me. But I was sensitive to that at that time.
Yeah, no, and I understand that though. It's
Yeah.
not nice.
Okay.
All right,
But
so we
I'll
have
cease being a victim and become a teacher again.
we have a couple of things just kind
Yeah.
of button up some of the other things.
Uh,
We've been talking about that a lot. We have the concept of leaving some of the field and resting your field, and this is an interesting concept, right? We have rights of animals, but there's even the idea of essentially nature itself to not just always try to get everything you can out of your environments. You can let it relax and let it regenerate and things like that, and that's important. And I think that's a good moral principle, right? You don't necessarily juice the rind of a lemon. I mean, I'm not saying that's probably in itself, but you know what I mean. Like, you don't always go for every last thing. Like, there's a certain point to just chill about it.
just for the sake of accuracy, we might have been allowed to wash the finger, but not the whole hand. I just don't want to be misquoted. If you want to go
Well,
back,
that's also your particular rabbinic
no, no,
tradition.
no, no,
So
no.
how do they know?
No, there's a rule, but
Oh,
I know. But the point I was making is that we couldn't take a shower
right,
on a Day of Atonement,
right.
and so these
The
small
accusation was ridiculous. Yeah,
right, yeah,
I
that's all.
got you.
That's my
You
point.
had put a lot of fences around it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
But no, but what do you think of this? The idea that your animals rest and I feel like that's a good principle to keep in mind. You would not say that. Well, I don't know. Maybe let's see what you would say. What would you say this means for a Christian farmer today? Should they be concerned with farming on their land in the seventh year, and why or why not?
I was actually hoping to get into a greater discussion of this later,
Okay, well we
but
can do that then.
but I
Hold that thought
but I will say
because
this.
it comes up a lot.
I
So
will say this. When you're a farmer, as far as I understand, rarely do you really fully own your farm. You may be paying a mortgage on it. You have somebody else that you're responsible to. And so
fair
in
enough.
the past, we have felt that when you're not in complete ownership, it's not the same thing.
But what
Uh,
if you are? What if you're like a homesteader off the grid type? And you're not really farming for anybody but yourself.
I would observe the sabbatical year
Okay.
if I could, if all things being equal. But in most cases, there's other factors to consider.
Right.
But I am
In favor of it.
favorable of the sabbatical year
Hmm.
under the right circumstance.
Right. Well, it doesn't say you should starve and do it. There's no punishment for it, right? It's a principle.
Now, I want to say this though, and this is important.
Okay.
The Jews have always felt it applies to the Holy Land,
Hmm.
as it were,
Yeah.
the land of promise, not to the rest of the world.
Right.
That's their feeling. I don't
Right.
I don't necessarily agree, but there is a view that this is specifically for the land of Israel, not the rest of the world. Now,
All
I,
right.
I was part of a church where we had college campuses where we did grow crops, and we had an agriculture department in Northeast Texas on the college campus,
Uh huh.
and we kept a sabbatical year, and we did find we were blessed in terms of produce when we kept a sabbatical year. And ironically, the campus in England, they just kept it in their seventh year. But it so happened coincidentally in Northeast Texas, our seventh year actually was the same as the sabbatical year as observed in Israel. Coincidentally, our seventh year was the same as the seventh year in Israel, which we kind of thought was had some significance. But
Now, does it also mean that there would be a rotation? That it would be different people 7 years? Like you start a farm and then it's the seventh year?
that's another question.
Or
Yeah,
is it a seventh year that you need to keep track of?
that's another question, right? I mean, the way the church used to deal with it is the church would say whenever, like, if you're planting a garden and you want to keep this rule, your seventh year, you would let it rest. However, there once was a family that came to me by mail and said, we'd like to coordinate with Israel. We'd like to keep our seventh year when they do it. And so I would say, yeah, go ahead if that's what you want to do.
Hmm.
And so
Now, are there a lot of farms in Israel doing this right now?
there are okay. That's why I was wanting to get into it later.
I'm
There,
sorry.
but in Israel, it was decided that uh, there were certain questions about whether the law applied. So what most religious farmers do is they technically sell the land to a non-Jew for the year and continue to farm.
Oh,
They have some kind of permit However, there are certain ultra-Orthodox Jews who do let their land rest,
Oh,
and then there are Jews in other parts of the world who help subsidize them through that year.
yeah,
So the ultra-Orthodox, some of them do let the land rest, and they have a network to help them through the year. And then the modern Orthodox have a permit that was allowed by the chief rabbi even before it became a state. I think Rabbi Cook, very famous,
hmm,
he allowed for a certain permit by temporarily it becomes somebody else's land for that year.
interesting.
So,
I mean, a lot of this deals with financial planning and things like that, which I think is part of the biblical system.
by the way, that's another important reason why it may not apply in general because it went along with release of debt for the year. But if you're having to pay your a debt, see
That makes a big
the resting
difference.
of the land was also
Yeah,
part of the release of debts.
yeah.
Now that's another problem that the Jews had. That we can get to
Keeping
that.
a jubilee year. Yeah, we
No,
haven't
no,
gone to
not no,
that.
I'm not talking about Jubilee. I'm
Oh,
talking about that the seventh year was a time of release of debt.
okay.
All right, so it's kind of
Right, right,
like,
right.
all right. So here's what I'm going to say. The Jews were not loaning money as they got near the seventh year because they figured they weren't going to get it back.
Uh-huh.
So the greatest of the rabbis, Hillel, developed what in Greek is called a prose bull, and that is where you pass your debts, you transfer your debts over to the court, to the rabbinical court, and they collect for you. So in effect, he undermined the original law because he felt like the reason he had authority to do it was because of what we read earlier. You can't oppress the poor, and the widow, the orphan, and so on. So he felt like because of the oppression going on, that he had the authority to transfer the debt so that the debt would be collected. So that's a whole other issue, but it all ties in. It all ties in. So I'm sorry to get into the weeds. I'm not sorry. I meant to get into the weeds.
That's the whole point of this
All right,
podcast. What are
all
you
right.
talking
I
about?
meant to get into the weeds later,
Oh,
but we can discuss
well,
these things.
I'm sorry that I messed up your plan, but we'll talk about it later,
All
and
right,
maybe we'll get questions along the way
all
too.
right, good. Well,
All right.
hopefully we provoked
So we
your
have the
thinking.
3 times a year we'll have a festival. I just want to we'll talk about the festivals more when we get to Leviticus and things like that. But it is important to know that they're already being mentioned here. Certainly Passover was mentioned already, and things like that. Um, and the one thing I will point out is where it says Robert Alter has the festival of the harvest, first fruits of your labor, and things like that. For some reason, people have this notion of a festival of first fruits, which is the wave sheep offering, but that is not a festival. It is an offering. We'll get to that in when we get to
Yeah,
Leviticus
the
23.
first fruits, of course, is Pentecost here.
Right, but yeah, I
Yeah,
just want to point out that the
right.
Festival of First Fruits is really what's called here the Festival of the Harvest, which is later going to be called the Festival of Pentecost. So, yes, there is a Festival of First Fruits, but it is not during the unleavened bread time. Just, you know.
Okay, another thing I want to say is the month is called here Aviv, which means spring.
Correct.
Nowadays, the spring is used for the whole season
Yeah.
rather than for the month. But Alter just translates it literally. He takes Aviv and translates it. He doesn't give you the word.
Yeah.
What is it he calls it? Green ears, the month of green ears,
New grain.
the month of new grain.
Yeah.
But in most translations, they give you the name Aviv,
Uh huh.
as in Tel Aviv, the city
Right.
nowadays.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to mention when it says all the males shall be here before me, I believe that that's talking about the fact that they were the ones that would actually go to the altar with the animal to be sacrificed, that the male would go that far, it would be more or less a male activity. So that's why he says all the males should appear before me, because they're the ones that are going to take the animal to the altar to be sacrificed.
Understandable, but here's the question.
Yeah.
When it says, all the people shall appear, but all the males should be appear before me, do you really think that means all the males, or is this a biblical all, and it's referring to a general principle, and there's representation and things like that?
Well, I also believe this, which I've not seen anywhere, but I insist on this. There were 48 Levitical cities. 13 of them were for the priests, and they were not that far from Jerusalem,
Uh huh.
kind of surrounding Jerusalem. But there were 35 other Levitical cities, and I believe that people didn't all have to go to Jerusalem. I believe they could go to the nearest Levitical city, and as you say, the sacrifices could be done on a representative basis, not everybody having to do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that the 35 Levitical cities were places people went. not everybody going to Jerusalem. I just don't see the logistics of that ever really being carried out. I mean, I think ideally you'd want to be in Jerusalem, and you see that Jesus was there.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, his parents took him there on the Passover in Luke 2. But
Some people say that Paul didn't observe this command because he was away from Jerusalem for so long. That is an interesting point.
well, I'm saying there were Jews all over the world later,
Mm-hmm.
and so it did become a difficult thing to
Yeah.
observe. You know,
Well, also at that point, the temple system was different, but yes,
anyway,
I mean, the temple was still standing then, though. So the question,
yeah.
I guess, here's the question: if they built the temple now, would you feel that people need to feel an obligation to go there 3 times a year?
No, but I would say it would be an ideal to try to go at some point, like in the Muslim world. You know, once or twice in your life
Okay.
you make the Hajj. I would say that if there were a temple, then Jews would feel like at some point they should be there.
Right.
Maybe,
So Orthodox Jews wouldn't necessarily demand it every single instance.
I don't think so because they didn't do it in the first century.
Gotcha.
You know.
Okay. And then obviously Christians, that's a whole nother matter. We'll get to that.
Right, right.
We'll get to that another way. All right. So yeah, so that being said, we can move forward. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell. We're going through the law, and we'll see you tomorrow.